The aircraft landed with a rough jolt, and a mix of relief and anticipation surged through me. Captain John Adams, I had spent the past 8 months navigating the harsh terrains of Afghanistan, leading my squad through skirmishes and ambushes, fueled by adrenaline and sheer willpower. Now, stepping onto American soil, my thoughts were consumed with reuniting with my wife, Jessica. I had imagined this moment countless times. The tender hug, the gentle kiss, the comforting sensation of being home. Walking through the terminal, my heart pounded with excitement. I saw Jessica near the arrivals gate, her blonde hair catching the light just as I remembered. But something seemed off. Her smile, usually radiant and full of affection, appeared forced, almost robotic. I brushed off the unease, telling myself it was just the awkwardness of being apart for so long. We had both changed during these months, hadn't we? "Hey there," I said, pulling her into an embrace. The contact felt unfamiliar, her body stiff, her arms hesitant. I kissed her forehead, but she turned away slightly, just enough for me to notice. "Welcome back," she murmured, her voice lacking warmth and enthusiasm. The words felt empty, devoid of the emotion I had yearned for. During the drive home, I tried to lighten the mood, sharing stories from my deployment, the camaraderie of my men, the close calls, and the triumphs. But Jessica remained distant, her responses curt and detached. She kept her eyes on the road, nodding at the right moments, but her mind seemed elsewhere. When we arrived at our modest home, a sense of unease settled over me. The house was spotless as always, but it felt cold, almost clinical. The framed photos on the walls, the ones from our wedding, vacations, and shared happy moments, seemed like relics from another era. Jessica led me inside, her movements brisk and efficient, more like a caretaker than a welcoming spouse. She mentioned that she had prepared my favorite meal, but there was no joy or pride in her voice. I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, convincing myself that we needed time to reconnect after such a long separation. But as days passed, the gap between us widened. Jessica was always on her phone, texting or browsing social media, even when we were supposed to be spending time together. She often left the house for hours, claiming to meet friends or run errands, but she always returned late with vague excuses that never quite made sense. Observant and detail-oriented from my years in the military, I started noticing other signs. Small things that alone meant nothing but together painted a troubling picture. At night, as Jessica lay beside me, her back turned and her breathing steady, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The warm, loving homecoming I had envisioned was slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I realized that the battlefield wasn't the only place where I had to fight for survival. The day had been uneventful, a quiet reprieve that John once would have cherished after the chaos of deployment. He spent most of it fixing things around the house, trying to reacclimate to civilian life. Jessica mentioned she would be out with friends that evening, so he decided to tackle a chore he had been avoiding, a leaking pipe in the basement. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old wood. John knelt by the pipe, busy with the wrench, but his mind kept drifting back to Jessica. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since his return. As he worked, he heard footsteps above. He froze, listening intently. Jessica was home earlier than expected. He heard her moving around the kitchen, the clinking of glass and the rustling of packaging. Then her voice, a voice he hadn't heard in what felt like ages, floated down the stairs, cheerful and light, completely unlike the cold, distant tone she had used with him recently. Curiosity got the better of him. He left the wrench on the ground and moved quietly to the foot of the stairs. Years of military training had made him stealthy. Every step was calculated, every movement precise as he crept up the stairs, careful not to make a sound. From his hidden position just out of sight, he could hear her clearly now. She was on the phone, her voice tinged with excitement. "I can't wait to see you again," she giggled, the sound like a dagger to his heart. "He's out of the house most of the time anyway. You should have seen his face when I told him I was going out with the girls tonight. Poor fool believed me." John felt his blood run cold. He strained to catch every word, his pulse thundering in his ears. She was talking about him, mocking him, belittling him. His heart pounded, each beat hammering against his chest like a drum. "And you know what the best part about my lover?" Jessica continued, her tone laced with cruel glee. He's such an alpha male. He can go 6 times without stopping. My clueless husband is nothing compared to him. We've already planned to get rid of that loser. It's just a matter of time. The words hung in the air, echoing in John's mind like a death knell. He stood frozen, his hands trembling as the reality of the situation crashed over him. The woman he had trusted with his life was planning to betray him, and not just betray him. She was planning to destroy him. His thoughts raced. How long had this been going on? How could he have been so blind, so naive? The rage that simmered beneath the surface began to boil over, his hands clenching into fists. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, for confrontation. But he knew he had to be smart, to think clearly. This was not a battlefield where brute force would win the day. This was a war of cunning, of strategy. I forced myself to retreat back down the stairs, my mind spinning. The man who had led soldiers through enemy fire, who had faced death countless times, now found himself standing in the basement of his own home, shaking with a rage he could barely contain. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. I sat in the darkened basement, the chill of the concrete floor seeping into my bones. The silence around me was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the house's electrical systems. My heart, however, was anything but silent. It pounded in my chest like a war drum, each beat fueled by a rage I had never known before. This wasn't the anger of a soldier on the battlefield. This was something deeper, something far more personal. The words I had overheard replayed in my mind, each one like a jagged piece of glass cutting into my soul. He's such an alpha male. He can go 6 times without stopping. My clueless husband is nothing compared to him. Jessica's voice, once a source of comfort and love, had turned into a twisted mockery of everything I had held dear. The woman I had loved, had fought for, had dreamed of returning to, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. My hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white with the force of my grip. I had faced death on the battlefield, had seen my comrades fall, had survived ambushes and firefights that should have killed me. But nothing had prepared me for this. This wasn't a battle I could win with a well-placed shot or a clever maneuver. This was a war of emotions, a war within my own home, and I had been blindsided. My mind raced, sifting through the years of our marriage, looking for signs I might have missed. The late nights, the sudden disinterest in our conversations, the way she had started to pull away long before I had left for my last deployment. It all seemed so clear now, as if I had been living in a fog, too wrapped up in my duty to notice my own life crumbling around me. I forced myself to take deep, measured breaths. I couldn't let the anger consume me, not yet. I needed to think, to plan. I had spent years in the military learning to control my emotions, to channel them into something productive, something that would keep me alive. Now I had to do the same, but this time the battlefield was my own home. They think I'm a fool, I thought bitterly. They think I'm some clueless husband too wrapped up in my own world to see what's happening right under my nose. But they were wrong, so very wrong. They had underestimated me, underestimated my capacity for cold, calculated revenge. They thought they could replace me, discard me like I was nothing. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, every muscle in my body tense with barely restrained fury. My mind was already working, formulating a plan, a strategy. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation where I'd storm in, demand answers, and vent my anger. No, that would be too easy, too quick. I wanted them to suffer, to feel the same pain and betrayal that I was feeling. I wanted to dismantle their lives piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ashes of their own deceit. You think I'm a clueless fool, I thought, a grim smile forming on my lips. You're about to learn just how wrong you are. I walked up the stairs, my mind set on what I had to do. I was no longer just a soldier coming home from war. I was a man betrayed, a man wronged, and I was about to show them what true betrayal looked like. The anger inside me wasn't just boiling, it was turning into something far more dangerous. It was turning into resolve. The hours crawled by, each second feeling like an eternity as I waited for Jessica to return. My anger simmered beneath the surface, cold and calculated. I heard the front door creak open upstairs, followed by the soft pad of her footsteps as she entered the house. She paused in the hallway, no doubt noticing the eerie silence that had settled over the home. I was waiting for her in the living room, seated on the couch, my expression unreadable. The only light in the room came from a single lamp, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Jessica stepped into the room, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me sitting there, wide awake. She quickly composed herself, but I caught the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice as sweet as ever, masking whatever emotions lurked beneath the surface. I forced a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. Thought we should talk." Jessica's smile wavered slightly, but she nodded, crossing the room to sit opposite me. "Sure. What about?" I didn't waste time with small talk. I leaned forward, my gaze piercing into hers. "Are you happy, Jessica?" The question took her off guard. She blinked, her smile faltering as she processed my words. "What? Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" "Because," I said slowly, standing up and taking a step toward her, "I overheard your conversation earlier, the one where you were laughing about how stupid I am and how great your lover is." The blood drained from Jessica's face, leaving her pale and stricken. Her mouth opened and closed, her eyes wide with shock and terror. "John, But before she could finish, my fist connected with her mouth, the force of the punch knocking her out of the chair and onto the floor. She screamed, a sharp, piercing sound as pain radiated through her jaw, blood pooling in her mouth, spilling onto the carpet as she clutched her face in horror. I loomed over her, my expression cold and unfeeling, like a soldier staring down a defeated enemy. "You think I'm a fool, Jessica? You think you can just use me like that?" Jessica tried to scramble away, her hands slipping in the blood as she struggled to get to her feet. But I was on her in an instant, my hand gripping her hair and yanking her back. She cried out in pain, her body trembling as she realized there was no escape. "I'm not done with you yet," I growled, my voice low and menacing. I pulled her up, forcing her to face me, the fear in her eyes a reflection of the cold, calculated rage that had consumed me. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground, and I was determined to emerge victorious. I had fought too many wars, survived too many battles, to let this betrayal go unanswered. And as I stared down at the woman I had once loved, I knew that the fight was far from over. Jessica lay crumpled on the floor, her body trembling, tears mingling with the blood dripping from her mouth. The physical pain was sharp, but it was the fear in her eyes that gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. My initial outburst had been raw, a visceral reaction to the profound betrayal I felt. But as I stood over her, the cold, calculating part of my mind took control. I knew that a single act of violence was not enough to satisfy the depth of my anger. No, what I wanted was far worse. I wanted to dismantle her life, piece by piece, to destroy her world as she had destroyed mine. I grabbed her arm and pulled her up with a roughness that made her gasp. I forced her to meet my gaze, my eyes cold and unyielding. "You think you can just leave me for him? Start a new life while I fade away into nothing?" Jessica, her voice shaky and barely above a whisper, tried to plead with me. "John, please, Shut up!" I interrupted, shoving her away with a disgusted sneer. "You're going to pay for this, Jessica, and so is your lover. You both think you're untouchable, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." Over the next few days, my rage transformed into a focused, meticulous drive for revenge. I became methodical, approaching the situation like a military operation. I planned everything down to the last detail, ensuring that nothing would lead back to me. I was going to destroy them both, but I was going to do it in a way that left them with no escape, no hope, and no future. My first step was to gather all the evidence I could. I hacked into Jessica's phone, a skill I had picked up during my time in the military, and began sifting through her digital life. Every text message, every voicemail, every photo, I devoured it all, piecing together the timeline of her betrayal. I learned the name of her lover, Matt, a smug corporate executive who probably thought he was invincible. My anger deepened as I read their messages, full of promises, plans for the future, and cruel jokes at my expense. But knowing wasn't enough. I wanted to do more than just expose them. I wanted to ruin them. I began by compiling the most incriminating evidence and sent it anonymously to Matt's wife. I imagined the shock, the devastation that would ripple through Matt's life. The affair would become public. a messy, humiliating divorce that would tarnish his reputation and drain his resources. I didn't stop there. I dug deeper into Matt's life, finding every skeleton in his closet, every business dealing that was less than above board. It didn't take long to find something shady. Contracts off the books, payments, and questionable relationships with government officials. I leaked this information to the press, ensuring that Matt's career would be obliterated. But this was only the beginning. I was relentless, setting up fake social media profiles to spread rumors and lies about both Jessica and Matt. I meticulously crafted posts and comments, painting them as untrustworthy, manipulative, and corrupt. Their friends and family began to distance themselves, influenced by the poison I had unleashed into their lives. The isolation began to take its toll, and I reveled in the knowledge that they were both suffering under the weight of public scrutiny and private turmoil. Everywhere they turned, they found hostility and suspicion. Their once comfortable lives were unraveling, their reputations in tatters, their social circles closing in on them. I watched it all unfold with cold satisfaction, knowing that my revenge was far from complete. I wanted them to experience the slow, agonizing destruction of everything they held dear, just as they had done to me. And as I sat back, my plan in motion, I felt a dark, grim sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control, about ensuring that they could never hurt me or anyone else again. The fallout from my meticulously crafted plan began slowly, like the first cracks in a dam. But once those cracks spread, the dam broke, unleashing a flood of ruin upon Jessica and Matt's lives. Each day brought a new wave of consequences, each one more devastating than the last. Jessica's trouble started at work. Whispers and sideways glances followed her through the halls. Colleagues who had once been friends now kept their distance. The rumors spread quickly, rumors of her affair, of the scandalous details that had somehow leaked out. The atmosphere became suffocating. She was called into her boss's office, where she was met with stern faces and an air of finality. They didn't mince words. Her reputation had become a liability, and they couldn't afford the scandal. She was terminated immediately, escorted out of the building like a criminal. The isolation was immediate and crushing. Friends she had once confided in stopped answering her calls. Her social media accounts were flooded with scorn and mockery. Every door she tried to open was slammed shut in her face. She was left alone, jobless, and drowning in the fallout of her own choices. The man she had planned to leave me for was now her only lifeline, and even that was slipping away. Matt's downfall was even more public. The anonymous tip about his extramarital affair landed in his wife's inbox with brutal clarity. She didn't wait for explanations or apologies. Divorce papers were served within days, and the story spread like wildfire through their social circles. The news reached his workplace, where his colleagues and superiors treated him like a pariah. His professional life crumbled just as quickly. The leaked information about his business dealings hit the press, leading to investigations and lawsuits. His company distanced itself from him, and clients withdrew their contracts. The empire he had built on deception and greed was collapsing, leaving him disgraced and destitute. John watched from a distance, his face a mask of cold detachment. He had orchestrated every detail, pulled every string, and now he was witnessing the fruits of his labor. But the satisfaction he felt was hollow. The anger that had driven him, the pain that had fueled his actions, had not dissipated. It lingered, a dark shadow over his thoughts. He had taken everything from them, but the emptiness within him remained. Despite the destruction he had wrought, I wasn't finished. I wanted to see their faces, to witness the moment when they realized who had orchestrated their downfall. I needed that final crushing blow to truly feel vindicated. And so, I devised one last move. I reached out to Jessica and Matt separately, crafting a message that played on their desperation. I framed it as a chance for closure, a final conversation to talk things out and perhaps find a way forward. The invitation was for a secluded cabin, a place where they could meet away from the prying eyes of the world that had turned against them. Jessica, with no job, no friends, and no future, was desperate for any chance at redemption, any hope that this nightmare could be resolved. Matt, his life in tatters, clung to the hope that this meeting could salvage something from the wreckage. Both of them, broken and defeated, accepted the invitation, unaware that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. I prepared the cabin meticulously, making sure every detail was perfect. I arrived early, checking the arrangements, ensuring everything was in place for the final act of my revenge. The cabin was sparsely furnished, the focal point being a single chair positioned opposite a large stone fireplace. On the wooden table beside me, a handgun rested, its cold metal glinting faintly in the dim light. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered, their heat doing nothing to thaw the icy resolve that gripped my heart. I had gone over this moment countless times in my mind, preparing for every possible outcome. Now, all that was left was to see it through. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence, followed by the faint slam of car doors. I didn't move, my eyes remaining fixed on the flames. The door creaked open, and I heard the hesitant footsteps of Jessica and Matt as they entered the cabin. They stopped abruptly when they saw me sitting there, the gun in plain view. "Sit down," I ordered, my voice devoid of emotion, as cold and commanding as a general addressing his troops. They hesitated, exchanging fearful glances, but the silent threat of the weapon was enough to make them comply. They took their seats, their movements stiff and jerky, like puppets on frayed strings. I finally turned to look at them, taking in their appearances. Jessica, with her tear-streaked face, looked nothing like the woman who had once held my heart. Matt, the man who had been so confident, so self-assured, now looked small and defeated. They were shadows of their former selves, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on them like a physical force. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to be betrayed like that?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears, her voice quivering as she tried to plead with me. "John, please, we're sorry. Sorry?" I cut her off with a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and mirthless. "You're sorry? You weren't sorry when you were laughing about me behind my back. You weren't sorry when you were planning to leave me for him." My gaze shifted to Matt, my eyes narrowing with contempt. "And you? You thought you could just waltz in and take what's mine? You thought you were better than me?" Matt's lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. He was too terrified to do anything but nod weakly, his face pale and drawn. I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, as if I were savoring the moment. I began pacing in front of them, my mind a storm of emotions. The power of the situation, the control I held over them, sent a cold surge of satisfaction through me. But it wasn't enough. I needed them to understand the depth of their betrayal, the enormity of the pain they had caused. "You know," I began, my voice measured, "when I was out there risking my life for this country, I used to think about home, about you, Jessica. You were my anchor. The thought of coming back to you kept me going, kept me sane. But now I see it was all a lie." I stopped pacing and turned to face them directly, the intensity of my stare making them both flinch. "You betrayed me in the worst way possible, and for what? A cheap thrill? Some fantasy about an alpha male? You don't even know what real strength is." I reached for the gun, my hand closing around the grip. Jessica gasped, her body trembling uncontrollably, while Matt sat frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "John, please," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "Don't do what? You think I'm going to kill you? No, death would be too easy, too quick. You both deserve to suffer, to live with the consequences of your actions." I paused, letting my words sink in. "But I want you to understand something. I could end this right now. I could pull this trigger, and it would all be over for you. But that would be mercy, and you don't deserve mercy." I slowly put the gun back down on the table, leaning in closer to them. "What you're going to do is live. Live with the knowledge that you've lost everything. Your reputations, your careers, your friends, your families, everything you've built, everything you've worked for, gone because you couldn't keep your desires in check." I straightened up, my gaze still locked on them. "You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to live with that shame for the rest of your lives. And if you ever think about coming after me, remember this moment. Remember that I hold all the cards. I have the evidence, the power, and the will to ruin you even further if I choose." Jessica was sobbing uncontrollably now, her hands covering her face as the full weight of their situation crashed down on her. Matt looked utterly defeated, his expression hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. They had been completely outmaneuvered by the man they had once mocked and underestimated. "Get out," I said quietly, but with an edge that made them both jump. "Get out of my sight, and don't ever come near me again." They scrambled to their feet, desperate to escape the cabin and the man who had destroyed their lives. As they rushed out, tripping over themselves in their haste, I watched them go, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The storm of rage and pain that had driven me was finally subsiding, leaving behind a cold, calculated clarity. I had taken my revenge, and now, as I stood alone in the quiet cabin, I realized that I had become something else entirely, something far more dangerous than the man they had betrayed. In the days that followed the confrontation, a heavy silence descended upon my life. The world outside continued as usual, but for me, everything had changed. I spent my days in a state of cold detachment, a far cry from the man I had once been. The remnants of my old life, the life I had shared with Jessica, were swiftly being dismantled. I wasted no time in filing for divorce. I approached it with the same ruthless efficiency I had applied to my revenge. I had gathered enough evidence to ensure that the settlement would be entirely in my favor. There would be no alimony, no shared assets, no mercy. Jessica would walk away with nothing, a fitting end to the betrayal she had engineered. When I finally met with my lawyer, the man had been struck by the lack of emotion in my demeanor. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a cold, calculating resolve. I signed the papers with a steady hand, the act feeling more like closing a business deal than ending a marriage. I left the lawyer's office without a backward glance, knowing that the finality of the divorce would soon be another nail in the coffin of Jessica's ruined life. The house was the next thing to go. Every room, every corner held memories tainted now by the betrayal that had unfolded within its walls. I couldn't bear the thought of staying there, of living in a place that had become a mausoleum for my old life. I put it on the market, pricing it to sell quickly, and within weeks, it was gone. The house was bought by a young couple eager to start their life together, unaware of the dark history that came with it. I left with only the essentials, determined to leave as much of the past behind as possible. I relocated to a new city, one where no one knew me or my story. It was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild myself from the ground up. The anonymity of the city was a balm to my wounded pride. I found a modest apartment, decorated it sparsely, and set about establishing a new routine. I threw myself into my work, using the structure and discipline of my military training to keep myself focused. But even as I built this new life, a part of me remained anchored in the past, in the cold satisfaction of my revenge. John didn't completely sever his connection to Matt, though. He kept tabs on him from afar, watching as the man's life continued to unravel. The scandals that I had set in motion had taken on a life of their own, spiraling out of control. Matt was forced to resign from his position, his reputation irreparably damaged. His marriage, already teetering on the brink, crumbled completely, ending in a bitter, drawn-out divorce. Matt was left with nothing but the ashes of his once successful life, his fall from grace complete. But I wasn't content to let them simply fade into obscurity. I wanted their suffering to be a constant reminder, a lingering ghost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. So I devised a way to keep their wounds fresh. I sent anonymous letters to Jessica, cruel reminders of what she had lost and what she had brought upon herself. The letters were always timed perfectly, arriving just when she might have thought the worst was over. Emails were sent to Matt, filled with venomous taunts about his downfall, each one a reminder of the man who had orchestrated his ruin. I even arranged for a few carefully placed news articles, subtle enough to seem like coincidences, but powerful enough to keep their shame in the public eye. With each reminder, each cruel twist of the knife, I felt a dark satisfaction. I had destroyed their lives, but it wasn't enough to just walk away. I wanted them to know that their pain and suffering would never truly end. They would carry it with them always, just as I carried the scars of their betrayal. As time went on, I found a twisted peace in my new life. The anger that had once driven me had cooled, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of control. I had taken back my life, my power, and I had done it on my own terms. But in the quiet moments, when the world around me was still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been lost in the process. The man I had been, the man who had loved and trusted so deeply, was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous.